Hello, my name is Chrissy Champagne. You are listening to Residue, a true crime podcast dedicated to keeping you paranoid. Today, I will be telling you the story of a hardworking single mother who was working her ass off with 2 jobs and a side hustle selling Mary Kay cosmetics just to provide for her children. Her 2 teenage children who didn't appreciate a damn thing that this woman did for them. This story is about to piss you off, whether you're a parent or not. This is the story of Susan Bailey, and my main source for today's episode was the book titled Let's Kill Mom by Donna Fielder. The names of certain individuals in this retelling of this case will be changed. Catherine and Stephen Morton were the parents of 4 children who have all now become adults and moved on with their own lives. So at this point, as grandparents and freshly new retirees, Catherine and Stephen are going to just start going on a lot of adventures together. And it's at this point that Catherine decides it would be a really good idea to start keeping a journal of all of their adventures. She starts her journal in the year 2006, and it started off as what Catherine or Kate called the mundane life of an older couple with many friends. She was documenting such things as the 2 of them going to a Crystal Gayle concert, getting flu shots, her grandkids coming to visit for Christmas, and she even talked about a play that she was in at one point called Bad Habits. In February of 2008, Kate starts writing again, sporadically. She wasn't keeping up in the journal as much as she used to, but now, 2 years later, June 22nd, 2008, on the way to Texas for her granddaughter Jennifer's high school graduation, Kate starts writing again. She writes that she arrived in Texas around 10 p.m. and her daughter was barely around. Kate's daughter was 43-year-old Susan Bailey. Now, Susan had just recently been divorced and she was a working single mother. She had a 3,500 square foot home that she was now running on her own with her 2 teenage children living inside of that home with her. She had no other choice but to constantly be working. She couldn't even take a little bit of time off when her parents came to visit for her daughter's high school graduation because she was planning on buying her daughter a car, and she was also planning on helping her daughter Jennifer start her college education. She was going to help Jennifer pay. So Susan was like, "Listen, Mom and Dad, I'm really sorry, but I have to work. I have to." Her mother, Kate, would now start using her journal more and more often to write as a place to vent about her stressful situations with her daughter, Susan, and with her grandchildren. Kate would now describe this horrible situation between her daughter and her grandchildren as a, quote, journey through hell. But Kate did not understand or even have the ability to grasp exactly how much of a hellish situation Susan was living in day to day. As a child, Susan Bailey, she was known as Susan Morton back then, was a bubbly, smart, funny, outgoing child. She loved music. She played the violin and she played the clarinet in the school band. She was really into her career goals, and what she wanted to move to California and work in the fashion industry. That was her dream and that was her goal, and she was going to make it happen. After high school, Susan leaves Minnesota and she arrives in California to pursue her career in fashion. She quickly finds a job in the J. Jacobs stores, which at that time was a huge chain. She is now going to meet a man who is in the military. He's in the Air Force, and she will marry him, and they will end up having 2 children. In 1990, they will have their daughter, Jennifer, and in 1994, 4 years later, they will have their son, David. A few years after starting their family, Susan is going to get promoted, and this will require the entire family moving to Texas. So they're going to move to Roanoke, Texas, and Susan is now going to be the supervisor in charge of 3 different stores across 3 different states. So this is going to involve a ton of travel. She is always going to be working. She is always going to be traveling. But this family had just bought their very newly built, I believe they had it built from the ground up, dream home, the 3,500 square foot dream home in a beautifully quiet, lovely community. So Susan is like hardcore working her ass off for her family while her husband is also doing the same. But there comes a time, a couple of years later, when her husband is now out of the military. He is not working. He is very rarely working. When he does, he's pulling in a little bit of money, but not enough to keep the family going. So Susan is doing double time. But then Susan loses her job. The chain company that she is working for, J. Jacobs, goes bankrupt. And now this family of 4 is living in this huge house with absolutely no income coming in. This is when Susan takes a job at a retail store in the mall and then also takes a second job at a different retail store, which I believe was Bed Bath & Beyond. She also decided to take on the side hustle that I mentioned earlier in the episode as a Mary Kay Cosmetics consultant. And if you don't know what Mary Kay is, that was a company back in the day that was similar to Avon Cosmetics that you could order from your neighbor or your friend. And this company would actually end up giving some of their highest selling employees a pink convertible that said Mary Kay across the side. This excited Susan because Susan's favorite color was pink. And you know, Susan was always someone that had the type of dreams that were big and she wanted to go for it. So this was her new dream, is that she told her friends, I am going to end up getting one of those Mary Kay convertibles one day. As you would expect, what would happen is that Susan is now very stressed. Financial difficulties are just plaguing this family, and her husband doesn't seem to be stepping up and helping out in his role as husband and father. So after 20 years of marriage, the couple divorces, and the judge would actually grant Susan complete full custody to both children. She would get both cars and she would get the home. It's at this point that her ex-husband is now going to move away to Iowa, and the children are hardly ever going to see him. Maybe once a year if they were lucky. Of course, now all the responsibility falls on Susan for everything, for taking care of the children, for raising the children, for supporting the children, and it gets a little difficult at times for her to be able to spend as much time as she would love to spend with her children. She does go out of her way to try to make those moments special. It was said that the family would often go see Harry Potter films together, and one thing they all loved to do was read. Jennifer especially was very big into fantasy novels, and so Susan would always make time to bring the children to the library because it was something that didn't cost a lot of money that the family could do together. Susan worked her ass off in those court hearings to be able to get full custody of her children. She fought, and then she was granted full custody, and she was not going to let the financial burden or the 2 jobs, the 3 jobs that she was working get in the way of her hanging out with her kids. She tried her hardest. But she's going to need some help. And now as Jennifer's getting a little older, Jennifer's 17 at this point, Jennifer should be able to help out around the house. She should see how much her mother is working, and she should be able to at least take care of David sometimes, because David is only 13 at this point. She should also be able to help out cleaning around the house. But do you think that Jennifer did that? No, because Jennifer was a spoiled little brat. At age 17, Jennifer Bailey was a pretty and sweet high school student. It was said that she had never really gotten into any trouble. She was really into school. She loved art. She was on the path to start art school in the next few months after graduation. She loved reading and she loved fantasy books. Now, it was said that she never got into any trouble, but that was until she met a boy named Paul. Now, Paul Allen Henson Jr. also attended Northwest High School. He met Jennifer Bailey in a Spanish class that the two took together. Paul was younger than Jennifer. He was only 16. Paul lived with his dad, Paul Henson Sr., and his stepmom, Terry Ann Henson. Now, Paul Henson Sr. also went through a divorce, and he also fought for full custody of his children the same way that Susan did. He did win full custody, and Paul lived with his dad and his stepmom in a trailer in Hazlet, Texas. Paul was only 16, but he didn't look 16. He was over 6 feet tall. He was 145 pounds, so he was really skinny, tall, with this long, bushy hair. The author of Let's Kill Mom describes Paul in the most amazing way, and I want to read that for you. She writes, "Peering into his blank dark eyes was like staring out a window on a black, starless night. But Jennifer loved those eyes." You know who didn't love those eyes? Susan Bailey, which, go ahead, Google a picture of Paul or go look at my Instagram because, yeah. But 17-year-old Jennifer, who had never had a boyfriend before and had never been infatuated, or as she thought it was, love, but let's all be real, that wasn't love. She was just so enamored by Paul. And a lot of the reason was because they had a lot of things in common. And those things were typical teenage things. They both loved music. They loved emo. They loved fantasy books, and they did love playing Dungeons and Dragons. They also both were really into witchcraft and said that they were Wiccans. So Jennifer said that she had an alter ego, and that alter ego went by the name of Lily. And guess what? Paul also had an alter ego. Paul told Jennifer that he had two personalities. He was Paul, and then he was also Talos. Now, Paul was, sweet, kind. He loved his friends. He was relaxed and chill, just loved to hang out. But Talos, oh, you do not want to mess with Talos, because the way Paul described it was that if I let Talos out, he's going to kill. Paul also claimed that Talos was the reincarnation of an executioner who lived in the 1800s. Talos is also a vampire. Talos was super busy. Paul's friends would also say that even though Paul wasn't the most attractive guy at school, he did pretty well with the ladies. And that brings us to another person that is involved with Jennifer and Paul. Now, this girl's name was Marilee. Marilee was only 14 years old. So now we have Paul at 16, Jennifer at 17, and now Marilee is going to enter this relationship as the third party, the threesome, at age 14. Marilee is not her real name. As I stated earlier, I was going to use a pseudonym. I'm using the same one that the author uses in Let's Kill Mom. I actually have been dreading telling this part of the story because I find it very disturbing that this was happening amongst a group of children ages 14 to 17. 14-year-old Marilee also attended the same high school as Paul and Jennifer, and it is said that one day Jennifer, at age 17 years old, is going to approach this young girl and is going to tell her that her friend has a crush on her. Guess who her friend is? It's Talos. So Jennifer is going to tell Marilee that Talos has a crush on her, but it's cool because even though Paul is dating Jennifer, Talos is allowed to date Marilee. Paul goes on to explain to both young girls that everything is okay. There's really no cheating going on here because he has two personalities. He is two males in a single body. And the girls agree to proceed with this relationship. It's at this point that the three of them are just hooked on each other. They are just now wrapped around each other's fingers. They're not going to leave each other's side. They are constantly with each other, and they are now also entering a sexual relationship with all three partners. The three of them even start wearing dog tags with each other's names on it. And it is said that Marilee actually told a friend of hers one day that Paul had been having sex with Jennifer, but in the middle of it, he turned into Talos. So that meant that Talos cheated on Marilee. And Marilee was complaining to her friend about this. And her friend was just like, what are you doing? And this would also lead to the fact that, of course, Marilee's mother is going to hate Paul and Jennifer. She doesn't want her daughter hanging out with them at all. And you know what? This is going to go for all of the parents. Paul's father does not want him near either one of these girls. Jennifer's mother, Susan, does not want her near Paul, and she doesn't really even know about Marilee at this point. And this is going to cause this forbidden love, tragic Romeo and Juliet in their minds type of situation. This relationship with Paul is causing so much friction in the Bailey household that there comes a point when Susan actually sends her youngest son, David, to go stay with her mom and dad, Kate and Steve Morton, in Minnesota. On top of everything she's dealing with Jennifer and Paul, Susan is also dealing with other things with her children, like the fact that she spent her hard-earned money on getting the family a phone plan. So she bought a phone for herself and a cell phone for David and Jennifer. And these two took total advantage of this, spending so much money that Susan ended up getting a $1,500 phone bill because the kids weren't abiding by the rules about, using the minutes or it was 2008, so cell phone minutes and data plans were different then. A $1,500 phone bill for 3 cell phones, I'd be pissed too. And here's the other thing. On top of all of this also, Susan is working extra time, taking more hours because she wants to help Jennifer get a car. School is starting soon, college is starting soon, and Jennifer doesn't want to take the bus. And so Susan is trying her hardest to help her get a car. But she soon finds out that she probably won't be able to make this happen before college starts. So she asks Jennifer if she could at least take the bus for a little bit. And Jennifer throws a little baby hissy fit, saying there's no way she's taking the bus. I mean, at this point with these children, they're home all day now, okay? And they are not helping Susan at all. Her house, her beautiful home that she worked so hard for, is a fucking disaster on the inside. There is just a mess everywhere you step. There is old food all over the place, open pizza boxes. The kids just throw their clothes everywhere. They have a dog named Ginger, and they are not helping out with Ginger at all. So Susan is just like at her wit's end. She is like, what the fuck? Like, I need a break. So she asks her parents to take David, and they do. And all goes well when they take David until one day they are in the car with David, and they are driving to a store, and he is requesting that they go buy, I believe it's a fishing pole. And the grandmother is like, no. She describes that David threw the most horrendous, horrific, scariest tantrum that she's ever seen, that she was actually scared. And she wanted to send David home at that point. it gets to the point where Susan does finally say, fine, Mom, put him on a plane, send him home. I'll take care of it. So now, on top of Jennifer and her disastrous love affair, her 13-year-old son, David, is also just nonstop being a nuisance. Like, he's always bratty. He's always got an attitude. He's getting in trouble at school now. He gets suspended because he brought a knife to school. It's just too much for Susan to handle as one person. And I guess a part of her kind of took a step back from really paying attention to what was going on in the home, which is definitely not her fault because this woman was a nonstop working, stressed out, just full of anxiety. Some of her coworkers had said later on that she did vent to them about what is going on in her home and how she doesn't know how to get control of her children. She just was at a loss as to what to do next. As I said earlier, first thing, we get rid of Paul. So Susan is saying to Jennifer, Paul's done. No more Paul at the house. Paul's father is also saying this to Paul. Do not go to Jennifer's house. We are done with this relationship. But on September 23rd, 2008, Paul Sr. is going to call the police department, the Roanoke Police Department, and tell them that he believes that his son has run away and that also he is missing his gun from the home. So he believes Paul has taken this gun and run away. He tells the police that it would probably be in their best interest to go to Susan Bailey's home and to speak to her because either Paul is there or at least Jennifer, Paul's ex, they think, girlfriend, can at least give the police kind of like a heads up to where he might be. So on this day, police arrive at Susan Bailey's home, and she's just completely confused. She's in the middle of already arguing with Jennifer as police arrive, and the police are like, hey, we're looking for Paul Henson Jr., and Susan says, well, he ain't here. I know that because she's not allowed to be with him. And Jennifer's like, I don't know. I don't know where Paul is. And the police ask Susan if they can come through the house and just walk around and take a look. This is a pretty big house. And so, of course, Susan's like, yeah, do it. And while they are doing that, Susan's just fighting with Jennifer this whole time. The two are bickering. Police walk around and they go up to Jennifer's room. And what they find is something a little strange. So they find a suitcase that Susan has never seen in her life, and they find a backpack. So they ask if they can open the suitcase. They start going through everything. And Susan says, oh my God, those are Paul's clothes. Like, Jennifer, where is Paul? And Jennifer just keeps saying, I don't know. I have no idea where Paul is. Police also take note that as they're walking through the house and they're trying to, just evaluate the situation, they notice that the house is really messy and dirty, like I mentioned earlier. And they also notice this strange bowl full of chocolate pudding, which they ask Susan about. And Susan's like, yeah, Jennifer made me that pudding as a dessert the other night, and it was disgusting. I took one bite and I was grossed out. So anyway, the police can't find anything. They can't find Paul. So they actually end up leaving. I believe after the police leave, it's at this point that Paul's father actually arrives at the house, and he also wants to come in and take a look because he is just adamant that Paul has to be in this home. So he's looking around a little bit, and he does notice that Paul's shoes are there at the house. And Jennifer was like, well, maybe he just left them here. And Paul Sr. is saying, Paul only has one pair of shoes. So unless he's walking around this town barefoot, then he is somewhere in this house. What Susan did not know was that this whole entire time that she's forbidding these children to see each other, Paul and Mara Lee are staying in her home. This home that she works her ass off for every day of her life, nonstop working 3 jobs. These teenagers are just hiding out here. And they would say that they would go under the beds at night when Susan would get home from work, and she was so tired that they would wait until she fell asleep before the three of them would just hang out in Jennifer's bedroom. These three children were under the assumption that in their little dark fantasy world that they had created, that if they weren't always together in this lifetime, that they weren't going to be able to be together in the afterlife. So they need to stay together. And what are they going to do now? Their parents are calling the cops now. They're going to soon find out where their hiding spot is. So the three of them come up with a plan. And that plan is that if they kill all of their parents, then the three of them can run away to Canada and they can live by themselves and start a commune. These kids, they're so funny to me because they can't clean their house. Jennifer's just constantly pissed off because she says that I always feel like I'm David's mom because my mom's always working all the time. So your brilliant plan is to get rid of your mom and then have to always take care of David? It just doesn't make any sense. But they're kids, they're children. They are not thinking everything through. And so obviously they're bound to get caught along the way. And the first to get caught is going to be Marilee, because Marilee has a runaway from home. Her mother has been looking everywhere for her. And then one day her mom just takes her car, starts driving down the street, and she sees her daughter just walking down the street. So she's like, get the fuck in the car. You're going home. And Marilee's pissed because now she's taken away from Paul and Jennifer. And if she's taken away, then she won't be a part of the threesome in the afterlife. And so she gets home. She's hysterical. Like she is throwing the biggest fit of her entire life. And finally, her mom calms everything down. Her mom is just exhausted from this entire situation. She decides she wants to take a nap, lay down for a little bit. And in the middle of her nap, she just feels something strange. She kind of feels like she felt like the side of her bed get hit by something, or she could feel someone standing over her on the side of her bed. She opens her eyes and her 14-year-old daughter, Marilee, is standing there with a butcher knife. And a fight breaks out between mother and daughter. Finally, Marilee's mother is able to get this butcher knife away from her daughter, and she calls 911, screaming hysterically for help. The cops arrive and they take 14-year-old Marilee off to the juvenile detention center. Meanwhile, back at Susan's home, the kids are still just hanging out. Susan's at work. She's trying to get a hold of her children. She keeps calling Jennifer, keeps calling David. They are not answering their phones, and she's a little nervous at work. So before she leaves work that night, she tells one of her coworkers that she wants to leave a little early because she is worried about the kids. She doesn't know why they're not answering their phones. So Susan leaves work and starts to head home. Susan arrives home to a dark house and she's calling the kids' names and they are not answering. It is at this point she feels something hit her and she feels someone come up from behind her and hold her. She then sees Jennifer come out from a bedroom and she tells Jennifer, call 911. And Jennifer says, no. Can you imagine that moment of realization in Susan's mind when she has seen the look of evil in her child's eyes, and she knows this is not good? But what exactly happened to Susan in that home would end up being a case that the police would have to put together on their own, because these three teenagers are not going to spill anything. But luckily, the hero in this story is a police officer that worked in South Dakota. Now, this police officer, he was the type of guy that was never going to be lazy on the job. He worked the night shift, and a lot of the other officers would love working the night shift because there wasn't really that much going on. This officer, he was like up for the challenge every night. So he was always keeping his eye out, and These three teenagers, Jennifer, Paul, and David, were going to come across a man that they did not have as a part of their plan. So the three of them had escaped in Susan's car, and they didn't have any money. They didn't have any idea where they were actually going. So they did actually bring along the family dog named Ginger. So it was the three teenagers and the family dog. It's now 3 a.m. in South Dakota, and the three of them stop at a gas station. But this gas station is closed. Not even the pumps are on. But there are 2 teenagers standing outside of the pumps, and this police officer sees them playing around with the pumps, playing around with the handles, and he's like, what is going on here? First of all, in this town in South Dakota, they have a curfew law. So there's no way that these kids should be out right now. The officer starts to follow their car. Now, he's not pulling them over. He doesn't have his sirens on, but he's just following them, keeping his eye on them, trying to figure out what the situation is. And Paul is driving. Paul actually ends up pulling over anyway, and the police officer gets out and approaches the vehicle. The officer gets Paul's ID, he gets Jennifer's ID, he finds out that David's only 13, so he doesn't have an ID, but he enters them into his system, and he finds out that earlier Paul had been on a runaway warrant. Like his dad had issued the call to go out saying, my son has run away. So he sees this from back in Roanoke, Texas. And he also finds out that the vehicle they are driving is registered to a Susan Bailey. When he asks them who's Susan Bailey, Jennifer says, "That's my mom." And she tells this officer that she was supposed to leave town, that her mother said, "You and David take my car, leave town, and go to Minnesota to live with your grandparents because I'm too stressed out to take care of you." And the officer's not buying that. What mother would do that? He thinks. He feels something's a little bit fishy. He especially gets a creepy feeling from Paul, who used to have long bushy hair, but the officer describes Paul now as having a really bad chopped off haircut. Like you can tell he just recently took a pair of scissors and just chopped his hair. So he's like, okay, let me get a hold of some Roanoke police and figure out who Susan Bailey is. So obviously, when he calls the Roanoke Police Department, he finds out that Susan Bailey's mother, Kate Morton, had just put in a call to the police department that day because her daughter and grandchildren have been missing. Kate Morton received a call that morning from her daughter's boss at the retail store saying, Susan didn't show up to work. This is unlike Susan. So the cops were called and they were asked to do a welfare check. And when they went to the house, they said that everything looked fine when they got to Susan Bailey's house. They said that the car wasn't in the driveway, the porch lights were on, and the house was dark. So they kind of took it as this is possible that this mother took her children and went on a road trip, and maybe that's why she left the porch lights on, because usually when people go away on vacation, they will leave some lights on. So that first wellness check didn't go as planned for Kate. The police never entered the home to see if Susan was okay. But now that this detective from South Dakota is calling and saying that he has all 3 children in a car in South Dakota at 3 a.m, what should I do with them? Who is this Susan Bailey? Is everything okay? Now police are going to go back to the home again, and this time they're going to go in. So while the officer in South Dakota has the 3 teenagers in his police department, he is just waiting on the Roanoke police to tell him what to do because he can't really hold these kids for very long. He does have them in jail right now under the curfew law, so he can hold them for a little bit. While being held, Jennifer also says something strange to the detective. She tells him that her mother had a boyfriend named Joseph, or Joe, and he was very violent and he was stalking Susan. So she's just a little worried that maybe something might be wrong with her mother, which, what do I always say? Whenever you start telling the cops your own theory on what could have happened, even though they don't even know anything happened, you're probably not innocent. Back in Roanoke, the police department is now going over to Susan's house, and they do find that a window is unlocked. So one of the officers goes in through the window, and he says that as he was walking to the front door to let the other officers in, he could just smell death. They knew that something was wrong. And all of the officers walk upstairs, and they do find the body of 43-year-old Susan Bailey laying face down on the hallway floor. They described the scene as a slaughterhouse. They said that Susan still had her name tag on from work. The carpets were soaked in blood, the walls, the door, everything was just covered in blood. They did say they also noticed that the bathroom door was open, and in the bathroom, the tub was full to the top with water. They also saw a frayed electrical cord hanging over the shower rod towards the water. They did also find a baseball bat. So when they find Susan's body, they will find that her throat is sliced open and described as sliced open all the way to the back of her spine. The autopsy report would show that Susan suffered 26 stab wounds. She was cut deep in her neck and throat. She suffered blunt force trauma and had 3 different types of stab wounds. There were deep slits, deep stab wounds, but there were also medium cuts that were not as deep. And then there was the barely scratched the skin knife cuts. The police would go on to speculate that the bulk of the stabbings had to be Paul. Paul was 6 feet tall. He was a lot bigger and taller than Susan. And Jennifer and David were just too tiny to be able to stab with such an intensity. The police would speculate that Jennifer had to have caused the medium cuts because, as they described, those knife wounds almost had a hesitation to them. Like, she didn't want to go through with it, but she did. And then the cuts that were just kind of scratching at her skin, they would say that those had to be done by David. In the home, the police would also find a Walmart receipt. And on that receipt, there was a list of cleaning products. And those were Formula 409 and bleach. And to me, one of the most chilling things on that list was that there were also 2 video game cards, like a PlayStation 4 or an Xbox card. So police would go to Walmart and they would get the surveillance footage, and what they would find was the day before the murder, they found on tape 13-year-old David casually riding his bicycle up to the front door of Walmart, parking it, going in, buying the cleaning supplies and 2 video game cards, and then happily riding his bike away. So this is going to be great evidence because now this is going to prove that these children planned this. And at this point, the police now have enough evidence to get arrest warrants. Jennifer was going to be arrested and tried as an adult because she was 17 years old. So in Texas at this time, at age 17, she was legally an adult. Then the other 2 would be tried as juveniles. After the arrest, police would describe a chilling moment as they brought David in for questioning, and they asked him, "Do you know why you are here?" And David responded with, "I'm here for committing capital murder on my mom." And he giggled. So David refuses to cooperate. The police described David as looking like a 10-year-old. He didn't look like a 13-year-old. He looked like he was 10. He was so tiny and frail, and they couldn't believe that such an evil presence was coming out of this person. So once everyone is arrested, they are going to bring in the Texas Rangers because at this point, the Texas Rangers have dealt with more serious crimes like this. I mean, Roanoke at this point was only known for petty crimes or theft or speeding. So they bring in the Texas Rangers and they bring in Detective Tracy Murphy. He is going to say that when he got Jennifer into the interrogation room, that she was just this meek, frail, tiny little girl who just seemed like she kept apologizing and saying she didn't understand what was wrong, and he couldn't even imagine that this tiny little girl would have done something this horrible. Jennifer has no idea that police searched her room, and they did find a piece of paper in her room where she had written down all of the new crazy, wonderful things she was going to do with her new life and with Paul in Canada. Why do people always write down in a journal what they're going to do after they kill someone? Like what, where, why, huh? Okay. Anyway, in Jennifer's room, also, they find a wallet. Now, inside of that wallet is a girl's ID, and it's not Jennifer. This girl's ID is the ID of Marilee. So now police are like, we need to find this Marilee girl, and they do. They find Marilee, as we said earlier, in the detention center for almost killing her mother. I mean, it doesn't take a seasoned detective to figure this shit out right now. So Detective Tracy Murphy is going to go to Jennifer, and he admits he's lying to Jennifer right now in the interrogation room. He's telling her that he went and saw Marilee, and Marilee told him everything. She spilled out the whole plan, but that was a lie. They didn't talk to Marilee yet. At this point, Detective Murphy says that this is the moment that Jennifer turned evil. He said he'd never seen such evil in his life, that if she could have been able to, she would have jumped over that table and strangled him to death. He said that her eyes turned black. She looked right at them and said, "I'm not talking anymore." Now, over in Paul's room, Paul is going to put on a little show for the detectives, and they're just going to laugh about it because you know what? Not everyone's going to fall for your Talos shit, Paul. Okay. So just like reel it back in for a minute. These detectives are like, stop it. Tell us what really happened. And he just becomes Paul again. He's like, oh, okay, yeah, you got me. And he tells them that this is all David's fault. And David did all of it, and he did none of it, and Jennifer did none of it, and Jennifer just wanted to save her brother David, so she came up with the plan for the three of them to get in the car and take off to Canada. So now detectives really are going to go talk to Marilee, and they are going to grant her immunity. The fact that Marilee was only 14, they had to get this approved by a judge to be able to go speak to her in the juvenile detention center. And when they do, they get the whole story. Marilee says that Jennifer Bailey was the mastermind behind this entire plan, that she even manipulated Paul at times. The first part of the plan was going to be that Jennifer said her mother loved chocolate pudding, so she crushed up a whole bottle of Tylenol into a bowl of chocolate pudding, and she thought that's how she would kill her mom. She told the other two in her relationship that they would also have to kill their parents, and then all of them could run away to Canada and they could bring David along. I wonder how much of this confession is true, because although I do believe that Jennifer had a huge part in it, it's hard to believe that she's just the mastermind when you hear what I'm about to tell you about David. So when David is in a room alone with Paul, the police get him on a recording. And now this is after he's killed his mother. This is after he has been arrested. They catch David on a recording saying, "I helped her pee," and then laughing. He's referring to the fact that when he stabbed his mother, she urinated all over the floor. And then he also goes on to say, quote, "You dumb Dora, you're stupid. We should have stuck her in a big wooden crate and mailed her to a zoo." They'd be like, "That's an ape?" I couldn't even say that. That was horrible. That child, he's 13. Why did he hate his mother so much? Their dad's the one that left. Their father's the one that I don't even really mention in this story. If you've noticed, I've never used a name because he doesn't want to be mentioned. He doesn't want anything to do with his kids. He wants no association. And then they go and take their rage out on the one person in their life that was doing everything she could for them. I'm so mad when I read that statement that David said. All three teenagers are going to plead guilty. And because David was the youngest, he was only 13, David would receive a 26-year prison sentence. And David Bailey will be released from prison in 2034, and he will only be 40 years old. That scares the shit out of me, because a person like that can say that about their mother, even if they're 13 years old, 40 years old is pretty young. Jennifer and Paul would both be sentenced to 60 years in prison, waiving any right to appeal. Jennifer Bailey and Paul Henson Jr. will be eligible for parole in the year 2038. When asked why she did this to her mother, what would cause her this much fury to do this to someone that loved her, Jennifer replied, "We just didn't see eye to eye." As Jennifer sat in her prison cell, she was crying hysterically. One of the prison guards walked up to Jennifer, knowing what her crime was, and she said to Jennifer, "What's wrong?" And Jennifer said back to her, "I just want to see my mom." The prison guard said, "Well, that's okay. We have visiting hours." Jennifer just cried more and more, asking for her mom. Thank you so much for joining me again this week on Residue. I appreciate you all so very much. And if you could do me a favor and maybe share the podcast with your friends, with your family, with your coworkers, if you would feel like maybe leaving a 5-star review, I wouldn't be mad if you did that. And if you want to follow me on social media, you can find me on Instagram as Residue Podcast, on Facebook, Residue, a true crime podcast, on TikTok, Residue Podcast, or you can go to the Residue webpage. It's residuepodcast.com. Send me an email. Let me know if there are any stories from your hometown that you would like me to cover. And until next Tuesday, I just want to say, stay safe and stay paranoid.